The rails were singing before I saw her, but it wasn't the whistle of any westbound locomotive that froze my blood. It was the frantic thump of a boot heel hammering the iron in a code only the doomed understand. There, at the bend where prairie grass meets mesquite, a woman lay lashed to the track, hair whipping like wildfire smoke, eyes fixed on the rising plume of an engine I could already smell. I was 2 rifle shots away, 1 borrowed horse beneath me, and a lifetime's worth of regret roaring in my chest. I didn't know who she was or why death had her name on a timetable, but I knew the sound of a soul being counted down, and I swore that morning death would miss its train. The sun had just begun to split the horizon in long golden ribbons when I saddled up and rode out along the north fence line. Morning on Brazos Spur was usually quiet, just the hush of wind brushing tall grass and the lowing of cattle starting their slow graze. But that day, something in the air was wrong. The birds had gone still. Even my horse, Biscuit, shifted under me like he knew it too. Steam whistled faintly in the distance. That wasn't unusual, not out here where iron rails carved through the prairie-like scars. But there wasn't a train due this early, and I knew the schedule better than my own birthday. Habit made me steer Biscuit toward the noise. Duty left over from a war I'd survived but never left kept me from turning back. That's when I saw the smoke. Not engine smoke. No whistle to follow, it's just a black smear rising slow and steady from the bend near McAllister's Creek. I kicked Biscuit into a gallop, half expecting some drifter's campfire or kids playing chicken with the tracks. What I found turned my blood to stone. She was lying across the rails. Her dress, what was left of it, was snagged under her hips and torn at the sleeves. Her wrists and ankles were bound in thick hemp rope, knots twisted like they'd been yanked tight by someone angry and in a damn hurry. Dust streaked her face, and 1 boot had come off, left lying half in the sagebrush. She was gagged, eyes wild and pleading, jerking her head just enough to catch sight of me as I dismounted. "Easy now," I said, voice low, though my heart was kicking like a spooked colt. "I'm gonna get you out of here." She made a sound through the gag that damn near broke me, half sob, half warning. That's when I felt it. The ground, starting to tremble. "The express, early. Hell," I muttered, yanking the Bowie knife from my saddle sheath. Shooting the knots wasn't an option. I wasn't about to risk putting a bullet through her. Leg cutting her free meant getting down on the track myself, and if I froze even for a second, she'd die. Maybe both of us. My stomach twisted. I'd frozen once before in the trenches, when my brother took the shot meant for me. I'd hesitated just 1 breath too long. Never again. I dropped to my knees, knife between my teeth, and lunged onto the steel. The vibration now wasn't just underfoot, it sang through my bones. The engine hadn't cleared the canyon bend yet, but it would, and when it did, there'd be no time left for thinking, only doing. And I'd be damned if I let history repeat itself. The steel beneath my knees thrummed like a living thing, each vibration climbing my spine in sharper waves. Somewhere beyond the cutbank curve, the locomotive's whistle shrieked a raw, hungry note that ripped across the plain and promised nothing but splintered bone if I didn't hurry. The coal reek drifted ahead of the train in oily clouds, stinging my eyes as I dug the Bowie's point under the soaked hemp binding Evelyn's ankles. The blade was dull from months of cutting baling twine. It gnawed more than sliced, and every sawing stroke scraped precious seconds off our lives. Evelyn's breaths came ragged through the gag, her chest heaving so hard the tatters of her dress fluttered like prairie flags. I could feel her panicked gaze drilling into me, begging faster, faster without words. The track shuddered harder, a tremor that rattled my teeth. Already the rails rang out their metallic warning, a hollow boom-boom that counted down the yards between death and us. "Hold on," I muttered, though the whistle drowned my voice. Hemp fibers parted one by fragile one under the knife's uneven edge. My knuckles slipped on sweat and dust. The blade bit my thumb, drawing a line of blood that darkened the rope. Half the bond still held when I heard the second sound, one far more personal than any whistle, the crack of a rifle echoing off rock. A slug sang past my ear and scuffed sparks off the rail inches from Evelyn's hip. Instinct flipped me sideways, half covering her with my body. On the ridge to the south, 2 riders reined up in silhouette against the newborn sun, bandanas masking their faces, rifles leveled. Whoever paid them wanted her dead. The train was only the surest guarantee. I bellowed a curse and leaned over her wrists, sawing harder. Another round pinged off steel, showering us with grit. The shriek of the approaching engine rose an octave, and light bloomed around the bend, a blinding headlamp tearing through the early haze. I was out of time, using my body as a wall. I wedged the knife under the last coil at her wrists, yanked, felt the fibers give way with a wet snap. She tried to sit, dizzy and unsteady. I hooked an arm under her shoulders, knife lost somewhere in the ballast, and pulled her across my chest, shielding her from the riflemen while the locomotive's roar churned the wind into a furnace of cinders and grit. "Don't look," I shouted, though she couldn't hear me above the crescendo. The ground shook like it meant to buck us straight into the sky. I took 1 heartbeat to judge the distance enough to see the cowcatcher's iron teeth flash past the blind curve, and made a choice no sane man would make twice instead of diving clear on my own. I locked both arms around Evelyn, rolled across the track perpendicular to the train's path, and let gravity and panic do the rest. Steel thunder blurred inches from my boots, sparks hissing off tires as the engine streaked past. The heat of the boiler seared through my coat, cinders peppered my back like hornets. I squeezed her tighter, prayed the ditch was close enough, and kicked off the rail with every shred of strength left. The world exploded in smoke and sand. We hit the embankment hard, tumbling through sagebrush and losing all direction. A roar of wind followed the engine, sucking air from my lungs. Gravel pelted us, a stinging hail driven by the train's slipstream. Then, as suddenly as it came, the thunder pulled away, rattling into distance, leaving only echo and the fading clang of rail joints cooling in its wake. Silence collapsed over the prairie, thick and stunned. For a moment I tasted iron and dust and nothing else. My head throbbed, warm liquid trailed past my ear. When I blinked, blood flecked my vision, and the sky reeled overhead. Evelyn lay half on top of me, limp, the gag loosened but still around her neck. I pressed 2 fingers to her throat, got a pulse, fast but steady. Her eyelids fluttered, then she sagged again, unconscious. A panicked whinny reached me. Biscuit, spooked by the train and gunfire, bolted across the flats, saddle empty and reins flapping. I cursed softly, another thing gone today, but stayed down, drawing a revolver from my belt with shaky hands. The ridge where the gunman had perched was empty. They must have assumed the engine finished what they started. Dust clouds dwindled behind their retreating horses far off to the west. My temple burned where a stray chip of ballast had split skin, blood matting my hair. I dabbed it, hissed, then pulled Evelyn closer, shielding her from the morning chill that rushed in once the engine's furnace heat rolled on. She weighed almost nothing, yet I felt the gravity of her presence as keenly as the tremor still fading. Beneath the rails, "We're alive," I whispered, more to convince myself than her, beyond the curve. The train's whistle gave one last mournful call, as though puzzled by what it missed. I stared after it, chest heaving, feeling the old guilt rear its head how close I'd come to freezing again. But I hadn't. This time, the knife had moved, the decision made, and the consequence lay breathing in my arms while the prairie tried to pretend nothing had happened at all. I eased to my knees, cradling her head against my shoulder. The gunmen were gone for now, but they'd be back once they learned the truth. Their employer wouldn't tolerate unfinished business. I had no horse, no supplies, and a woman who'd nearly died under a locomotive's wheels. Yet there was a spark in my chest, something fierce and stubborn, as Mesquith had told me I wasn't done saving her. Not by a long mile of iron track. The abandoned water tower stood a quarter-mile off the track, its rusted legs crooked like an old mare but still casting a patch of shade against the desert glare. I half-carried, half-dragged Evelyn across sharp scrub, my boots slipping in loose shale while sweat stung the cut on my temple. Inside, the air smelled of creosote, and stale rainwater caught in the cistern overhead. I laid her on a patch of burlap I found wedged behind a ladder rung, tore my bandana into strips, and cleaned the raw rope burns around her wrists. She flinched awake, eyes wide, until she recognized me, the panic ebbing just enough for gratitude to shine through. "Easy," I whispered, pouring the last of my canteen over her swollen ankles. "No one's gonna tie you down again." Her voice came out cracked but steady. "They almost did. Cole. Barrett almost won." The name meant nothing then, so I asked, and the story poured out in ragged breaths. Barrett Sloan, her fiancé, by society's decree, railroad baron by ruthless ambition, had discovered her late mother's inheritance, thousands of acres overlapping every struggling ranch along the Brazos Spur, mine included, land he meant to seize, flip to the railway, then drive tracks straight through, bleeding dry every cattleman who couldn't pay his inflated freight. Evelyn had threatened exposure, so Barrett arranged a quieter solution: stage a kidnapping, bind her to iron, let the express deliver a tragedy. The riders on the ridge were his insurance. I listened, anger swirling with something harder to name. Saving her suddenly felt knotted into saving everything my father built, and everything I kept failing to protect. When she met my eyes with a trembling sort of awe, I realized she saw in me the courage she'd been shamed for losing under Barrett's thumb. That look weighed more than any saddlebag. Dusk bled purple through the slats when the first shot punched a hole in the tin siding. Sparks leaped from dusty floorboards. The gunmen were back, torches in hand, their silhouettes flickering beyond the doorway. Fire licked up the walls like it had been waiting all day for permission. Heat drove us upward onto the narrow catwalk that circled the tank. Smoke clawed my throat. I kicked out a pane, shattered glass raining below, then swung Evelyn through the gap onto the platform outside. From there we leaped to the ground, rolling down a slope of brittle grass that crackled under raining cinders. One rider waited at the base, reloading. I barreled into him shoulder first. His rifle skittered away. Evelyn snatched his reins while I drove an elbow into his jaw. Swift final. She climbed astride the black gelding, eyes blazing, and held out her hand to me. Behind us the tower collapsed, timbers roaring, embers spiraling into a night newly born afire. We rode hard into the dry gulch, hooves thundering through dust as hot ash drifted like orange snow. Miles later, the desert opened onto a low plateau, dotted with saguaro and mesquite. We stopped near a dry creek bed where moonlight silvered the world too quiet. I gathered deadwood, struck a spark with the back of my bowie, and coaxed a small flame alive. We sat opposite each other, flames painting her soot-streaked face in warm light. I handed her my canteen refilled hours earlier at a seep we passed and watched her drink like a woman return to herself. She asked about the scar on my forearm, the one that always itched before a storm. I told her about the war, the trenches, the moment my brother yelled for me to move and I froze instead. How I'd carried his last breath home and buried it under endless work that never seemed to pay the bank. She listened in that quiet way people do when they're adding your pain to their own ledger. Then she spoke of ballroom ceilings so high they echoed with emptiness, of gilded lies disguised as compliments, of signing her name to engagement papers with a pen she felt was loaded. Her laughter, when it came, was small and startled, like a fawn stepping from Brushan apology for taking up space that I didn't need. Our fire burned low, sparks lifting into a vault of stars so clear it hurt. The air between us tightened, something raw and electric, and I knew if I reached for her then the whole world would tilt. Yet words failed, or perhaps restraint won, because dawn's first violet hinted at the horizon before either of us spoke again. "We can still stop him," she said, voice near a whisper. "The deeds are locked in the Redstone Junction office safe. My signature's forged on half of them." I pictured the depot, a brick fortress with brass-bound doors less than 20 miles east. I pictured Barrett Sloan basking in tomorrow's headlines and the rest of us choking on dust. And I pictured Evelyn, free of irons yet still shackled by every acre he meant to steal. "Then we ride," I answered, standing to stamp out the embers. "We'll be in Redstone by first bell. While the town is waking, we'll make sure Barrett never sleeps easy again." She rose beside me, wrapped the tattered remains of her shawl tight as wind kicked up the cooling sand. A faint smile tugged her lips, part relief, part steel. Moonlight turned the rope burns on her wrists into pale rings, like vows made by fire and iron. I found myself believing they might yet be recast into something kinder. We saddled the stolen gelding together, my palm brushing hers as we tightened the cinch. A current sparked, brief but undeniable, and neither of us pulled away. Night folded around us as we mounted. Behind, the smoldering tower marked our past, in a dying glow. Ahead, the rail's silver trail pointed toward reckoning. We nudged the horse east, two silhouettes pressed close in the narrowing dark, carrying between us guilt, hope, and a pact forged not by contracts but by raw necessity, and the sudden unspoken desire to see one another safely through the storm Barrett Sloan had set in motion. Sun sat straight overhead when the dusty street of Redstone Junction came into view, the rail depot gleaming like a brass idol against the hard blue sky. A banner fluttered above the platforms Lone and Western. "The future arrives today." Townsfolk jammed shoulder to shoulder to hear Barrett Sloan preach progress. Evelyn and I reined the stolen gelding at the edge of the crowd. Wanted notices flapped on every post. Cole Anders abductor, $500 dead or alive. My own face stared back in fresh ink. A poor likeness, but good enough to turn wary glances our way. I felt Evelyn tense behind me, the heat of her palm steady on my ribs as she slid down first. Smoke-scorched hair clung to her cheeks. Her dress, still streaked with ash, looked like battle colors. Sloan stood on a freight crate, cream suit spotless, mustache trimmed to a razor line. He talked about iron rails knitting states together, about fortunes waiting beneath wheels, never mind the ranches in the path. His voice oiled through the depot's arches, each promise met with cautious applause. Evelyn threaded through the listeners until she was 10 paces from him, then tore the gag fabric from her pocket and hurled it at his polished boots. "That's the progress you peddle," she called, voice hoarse but clear. "Binding a woman to the rails and hoping the train keeps the secret." Gasps rolled like tumbleweed. Deputies resting on porch rails froze, boots half lifted. Sloan's smile curdled. "My fiancée is confused," he said, reaching as if to soothe her kidnapped hand, clearly traumatized by that man. He jabbed a finger toward me. "Arrest him." I stepped forward before the badges could move, left hand lazily swinging the coiled lariat I'd cut from a post outside town. "You really want round two, Barrett?" The sun caught the bowie sheathed at my hip. I saw his eyes tick to it like a clock hand striking high noon. 3 hired guns melted from the crowd, revolvers out in the same breath. I flicked the rope here of branding calves firing through my muscles, loop sailing wide before snapping tight around the nearest gunman's wrist. A hard yank jerked his weapon skyward. The shot shattered the station clock instead of my chest. Chaos burst. The second thug lunged. I rolled, kicked his knees, swept his colt away with rope slack, then swung the loop low, catching the third man's ankles. He slammed chin first into dust. Sloan dragged Evelyn backward through the parting audience, toward an outbound freight already chuffing steam. She clawed at his arm, but he clamped a pistol under her chin, daring the town to follow. I sprinted after them, vaulted a baggage cart and grabbed the rear ladder of the last boxcar just as the wheels clanked into motion. Wind-whipped coals soot into my eyes. Sloane hauled Evelyn onto the flat-topped livestock car ahead, shouting for the engineer to pour it on. Metal rattled under my boots while I climbed. The moment my head cleared the roofline, Sloane fired. The bullet tore a splinter from the plank, near my ear. I ducked behind a hatch door, heart thumping in tune with the pistons. Evelyn struggled in his grip, giving me seconds. I drew the bowie, slid low across tarboards, and sliced a coupling pin locked beside my car's lurched. Sloane lost footing, steadied, cursed. I surged upright, knife flashing, steam vented between cars like dragon breath. Sloane threw Evelyn aside and advanced, pistol tracking me. I feinted left. He fired, missed, then I slashed, knocking the barrel offline. Another swing and the pistol clattered off the roof. Fury twisted his features. He drove at me bare-handed. We grappled over the gap between cars, train hammering beneath. At the crest of his rage he reached for my scarred forearm, the same one Evelyn had tended, intending to wrench me into the wheels. Pain flared, but I remembered rope fibers parting under that water tower fire, remembered my brother's final cry, and I would not freeze. I drove the buoy's hilt into Sloane's ribs, spun him across the seam, and he stumbled into the yawning gap. Steam swallowed his scream. Iron wheels sang their relentless song. I crawled to Evelyn, pulled her close as speed bled from the train. The engineer having seen enough. Deputies riding hard along the embankment waved white kerchiefs. Townspeople gathered on a trestle, shock painted on their faces. When we rolled to a stop by the platform, I helped her down first. My knees shook, from more than exhaustion. She steadied me, then strode to the stunned sheriff, recounting every forged deed, every attempt on her life. Keys changed hands. The safe in the depot office opened. Stolen land rights spilled out like plundered hearts. Paperwork finished. Crowd dispersed. An evening painted long amber stripes across the siding. I stood where I'd first fought the gunman, suddenly adrift without the roar of crisis. Evelyn crossed the platform, holding the deeds she'd signed back to honest names. "Cole," she said softly, offering her hand, the same hand I had once grasped out of desperate urgency. Now it was choice, pure and fragile. I slipped my scarred palm into hers. Weeks later, with Sloane's empire crumbled and his shareholders scattering like quail, Evelyn invested her inheritance into my failing spread. Together we built a modest rail stop, just a water tank, a feed store, and a corral, but it served cattlemen fare and kept money in the valley instead of bleeding it east. On a lavender evening, we walked the repaired track that had nearly been her grave. She paused, drew a length of sky-blue silk from her pocket, and tied it around the white ridge of my forearm scar. The knot settled warm against my skin, soft, where iron had once burned. Somewhere behind us a train whistle sounded, distant and almost kind. She smiled, eyes reflecting the copper sunset, and I thought of ropes, those that shackle and those that hold fast against every storm the desert can hurl. I lifted her hand to my lips, breathed in dust and hope, and let the future hitch itself to our hearts. Some knots hold you down, some bind you to what you love. The trick is knowing when to cut loose and when to hang on with all you've got.